The Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, can be seen as beginning with Descartes' Discourse on Method of 1637 and ending with the Romantic movement at the end of the 18th century. But in order to give a period a name, it must have certain characteristics that everyone agrees, especially within the time itself, characterize or reflect that period. And we can see these characteristics quite clearly in the Enlightenment, ideas to which most rationalists would subscribe. First, there was general hostility to the irrational, and the irrational could take many forms: irrationalism in politics, irrationalism in religion. Also, most rationalists sought freedom, believed in progress, and believed in knowledge and education. They believed, in fact, that knowledge of the natural world through the critical use of reason and empirical observation would provide not just absolute knowledge of how the universe functions and satisfy the curiosity of how the universe, in fact, operates, but also it provided a bit of guidance as to what human or positive law should look like, how these things should reflect this natural universe, which was, of course, by definition, good. Also, we saw with John Locke, education was significant. All rationalists believed in the efficacy of education. And education should serve secular needs and secular goals. That is, how to help individuals get through the day and understand the world in which they live. There was no point to understand the ways of God or to justify the ways of God to man or to illuminate scriptural sources. These elements of the Middle Ages and the Reformation were seen as of no value whatsoever to the educational structure of the Enlightenment. Also, the concept of systematic doubt that we saw beginning so powerfully with Bacon and especially Descartes exploded all those things that could not be proved rationally. And we also established that after Newton and Newton's absolute laws of nature, that the universe itself was comprehensible, that we could see the forces that drive it, that we can understand how it works. So, as we've seen, the universe became a great complex machine, and it operated according to those principles that Newton had identified. There is no divine interference. God isn't there moving the levers and making it run. The forces of physics and cosmology make it run. A natural corollary to this: if the principles that drive the machine are understood, then those things that are not part of that machine fall into a different category of responsibility. Rational men and women could alter the circumstances of those things that are not absolute. To know what is absolute and immutable is to give a strong clue as to what is malleable and what is changeable. Consequently, the belief then that men and women on earth see circumstances within their control as part of the particular precinct and responsibility of human action. That is, their political, their social, and their economic systems. These pertain to men, and so they should be determined and run by men. So the idea of the isolation of human society and government as the responsibility of human reason alone, again, like the universe, independent of God and independent of the church, independent of an authority that could get in the way of the operation of reason and the understanding of demonstrable truth, all of these things then help society to define itself in a way that would be more in tune with that natural law, which, as we've seen, is a law of nature and consequently good by definition. The closer that human or positive law gets to natural law, then the happier human society will be, because it will be closer to those principles that are in fact good. But if human society is the responsibility of human beings, and if we are the ones who build government and the economy and social structure, then we have to have goals. If you then take away the divine injunction of trying to live according to God's plan for man or trying to fulfill those descriptions in Scripture that give some indication of what society should look like, then you have to develop secular goals. Secular goals developing without divine guidance then determine a new set of rules that were applicable to human society and could be realized and activated by men and women within that society. And these then should become not just the points of discussion or abstractions to be investigated. They actually should be the principles in which government is constructed. So the rejection of any form of divine injunction or divine intervention would mean that these rules would have to be clearly delineated and would have to apply to conditions that were by definition human. It had to do with the lives of men and women on earth. Well, first and to some degree foremost, the most elemental principle to which again all rationalists would subscribe would be utility. By that we simply mean practicality. What is practical? What is useful? This again is based upon an assumption, and the assumption that it is whatever is useful is good. Well, how do you determine what is useful? Well, what is useful is anything that promotes human happiness and welfare. Consequently, we can see that the systems that make the greatest happiness for the greatest number would be good and useful. But there's a negative aspect to this too. Any economic system which exploited the misery of many for the happiness of the few is irrational, not useful, and in fact, therefore, wrong. Other elements like war, the war of aggression. Why should people sacrifice their lives or be sacrificed by others in order to increase territory, which, as Voltaire remarked, the king probably couldn't rule anyway? Why should injustice be accepted? Justice should be a useful product. It should ensure that the most people in society can live according to rules where they would achieve the greatest satisfaction and there would be some element of fairness. Well, any of those elements that provide misery were completely against the rational perspective. So consequently, we see utility and goodness, practicality, and the operation of a system that ensures that the greatest good will come to the greatest number as one of the fundamental platforms in which the rationalist perspective of society and government will be built. Well, these sorts of ideas gave enormous confidence to the philosophes. Philosophes, the word is simply the French term for philosopher, but it was a common term. These were the disciples of rationalism, those who sought to apply the principles of reason to every aspect of the human condition and to reduce as far as possible the influence of anything that was irrational. They were all revolutionaries by nature because they were seeking a new basis for human society founded on utility, founded on natural law, and founded on reason, which to some extent was the instrument for understanding all the others. To indicate just how revolutionary this was, let me quote one. "Reason will clear up the mess that superstition, revelation, and faith, which is the very devil for us rationalists, have piled up on earth." A statement like this, of course, is a kind of declaration of war against the concept of revealed religion in the church. It also is a declaration of war against an absolute state that must be accepted on faith, as does religion. The fundamental principles, then, that had animated society through much of European history up to that point are now being called into fundamental question. And you add to this the concept that we've seen developing in John Locke and spreading widely that all men and women, simply by virtue of being born human beings, deserve life, liberty, and happiness, was revolutionary as well. You put these things together and you have a fundamental critique of society as it then existed in the 18th century, in that Ancien Régime, that union of throne and altar of the absolute Bourbon monarchy in France. And also, this confidence that came to the humanists, the confidence that came to the philosophes, should really be reflected also in the fact that they now were seeing the world as a quite wonderful place, because it was no longer a vale of tears. It wasn't a world to be suffered as you await your reward in the next. Now what they saw is a whole new world being born, and possibility to be realized according to principles which they had identified and which they could actually see potentially in operation. So this self-confidence was in fact based upon a set of principles that they actually believed they could deliver. And again, there is nothing more revolutionary than a group of thinkers who actually believe they can accomplish their dreams. Well, one of the examples that indicates just how revolutionary this could become, and how, in fact, those who identified with the philosophes could carry these ideas in opposition to the established order, is the life and works of François-Marie Hérouet de Voltaire, one of the great voices of reason of the 18th century. Voltaire was an interesting guy. He was born middle class, the son of a notary. He added the aristocratic particule to his own name, which is an irony because he might not have liked the nobility very much, but he also pretended to be one of them. And he illustrated the style and the values of the Enlightenment. And he also experienced the problems that such thinkers confronted when they came against the authority of the absolute church and state. Voltaire's formative moment, to some extent, was a long trip to England in 1726. He observed English society and government, and he was there to study Newtonian science, because Voltaire, like so many of the philosophes, was a polymath. He was just as interested in experimental science as he was in philosophy and religion and literature. And when he was in England, he truly recognized the difference between France, his country, ruled as it was by an absolute king and presided over by an obscurantist church, and the constitutional monarchy of England. And it was crystallized by a moment. It was crystallized by a dramatic moment when he observed the great state funeral that was accorded to Isaac Newton in 1727. Because he said Newton was buried with great pomp in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by kings and queens. Had Newton been French, he would have to have been buried secretly at night in unconsecrated ground. Well, besides observing and experiencing on a rather visceral level the difference in the experience of England and France, two books emerged from this time. His philosophical letters concerning the English nation, which he had printed in 1732, and Elements of the Philosophy, note philosophy, of Newton, of 1738. Now, these books indicate Voltaire's debt to Newton and discovery of universal laws of nature and so on, and also to Locke's psychology of experience and Bacon's doctrine of the centrality of empirical observation. The things that we've talked about, this is obvious, and of course it was then part of the frame of reference in the worldview and the vocabulary of rationalist thinkers. But he also realized that other elements that we will talk about in more detail later, a free press, political liberty, and freedom of expression, had fundamental differences as well. And in fact, to some extent, to actually produce these books made ideas that had developed in England in that particular context generally available to a much wider audience. One of the great ironies is that the government of Louis XIV and his wars of glory and expansion and the building of Versailles in the style of the French monarchy had made French the lingua franca of the elite across the continent, from St. Petersburg down to the tip of Naples. So when Voltaire wrote these books in French, he popularized and made available ideas that had developed in England and could now be understood, read, studied, and discussed by anyone with education who could read French. And Voltaire was a great popularizer and took these complex theories and turned them into easily assimilable ideas. After about 1740, Voltaire began to shift his perspective. And in fact, he increasingly began to turn against the abuses of the French church. He saw it as an oppressive organization, not only oppressing the personal and spiritual freedom of people, but also crushing their intellectual freedom. The result is he developed a rallying cry of "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamy. And what this means, of course, is the infamy of bigotry, superstition, and intolerance, as well as the wealth and power of the French church, which he truly believed was being used against the liberty of the people. Near the end of his life, in fact, the last decades of his life, Voltaire returned again and again to these elements, and he adopted dangerous causes in order to make clear just how badly the French church acted during the Ancien Regime. And this we'll see is important in the Revolution, and it helps explain why the revolutionary government so early in the process turned against the church and used the church as an instrument in order to to achieve secular ends. Because without Voltaire, this general attitude towards the French church as being obscurantist and repressive would probably not have reached the level that it did, that reached its fruition in 1789. But at the same time, Voltaire hated the French church, and he hated the obscurantism of its organization and the special role that it played in French society. But at the same time, he also felt that the belief in some form of divine being was reasonable and rational. In fact, the idea to Voltaire of there being a God of some kind of divine being, he didn't like the word God, some sort of divine being, was really based on reason. And after about 1759, he began to develop these ideas with a certain degree of sophistication. First of all, if you accept the Newtonian universe, then there had to be the engineer or the architect or the force that set the pendulum swinging, that prima mobile. So that was a reasonable thing. And also, he realized that there was need of an operative morality. That is, that people needed the same moral rules to live by, rules that were not necessarily the laws of the state, but a sense of right and wrong that was generally shared as a lubricant to society. And these things, Voltaire said, would be perfectly reasonable and perfectly natural and based upon the application of reason. So Voltaire then began to create and to design a new form of religion, and he called it deism. Now, deism accepted the prima mobile, accepted an operative morality, but it didn't accept any form of divine revelation, which he particularly disliked, or he saw no need for an ecclesiastical order. There needed to be no priests. Why were there bishops? Why was there an ecclesiastical structure at all? Because these are things that individuals could in fact deal with internally, according to their own principles and their own spiritual needs. Well, this idea of deism, he developed most fully in a truly remarkable book, a very famous book. The Essay on the Manners and Spirits of Nations of 1756, the famous Essay sur les Mœurs. This is a curious book because what it really is a universal history. There's a long tradition in Europe of universal histories. Middle Ages, it was one of the basic historical genres, and during the Reformation, it had a rehabilitation because it was necessary, again, to show that the Reformation was part of God's plan for man and that the Reformation was returning back to the way the church used to be, and so was a good thing. But Voltaire's universal history was nothing like this at all. Voltaire's universal history didn't begin with the creation, didn't begin with the birth of Christ or any other of those moments of Christianity. Rather, it begins in ancient China, and it traces human progress by comparing one civilization with the other. Well, why is it significant? Well, first of all, it knocked Europeans a bit out of their Eurocentricity, but more significantly, he made the point very, very powerfully that human civilization, human progress, and human development was dependent on and driven by human causality. In other words, the decisions that men made in government and in their lives will determine the future of their society and the future of society yet to come. In fact, human causality becomes almost a Newtonian law, a set of causes and effects, of challenges and responses that allowed progress to happen. And of course, his hope for his own nation was that progress would indeed happen based upon a number of assumptions that he hoped would be based upon reason and demonstrable truth. So we are responsible, according to Voltaire, for our own world. We're responsible for the society in which we live. So it's extremely important that we get it right. And we'll return to this on a number of occasions, how so many of the philosophers of the Enlightenment were obsessed with getting it right, not just because of the application of scientific method, but also because of the need to ensure that the information that you have for making decisions is correct and acceptable, and that the rational process applied to this information was in fact right. Well, Voltaire wrote much more popular works, works that are still read and are hilarious to this day. For example, his novella Candide of 1759. Candide, besides being very, very funny and one of the great picaresque novels of all time and turned into, in fact, a modern opera by Leonard Bernstein, also is one of the great satires. And it satirizes the church in particular and the idea of a beneficent God, because it takes as its point of departure the terrible Lisbon earthquake. And Voltaire asks, if there were a beneficent God, how could he permit this terrible suffering on the part of so many innocent people? And the book goes on from there. Satirizes war, satirizes religious intolerance, and of course satirizes clerics to a very great degree. Well, Voltaire was a brilliant satirist. Voltaire was a brilliant stylist. And his critique of the Ancien Régime was in fact the most incisive imaginable. But he offered little concrete in its place. Voltaire was much better at destructive or instructive satire than in constructive thought. He wasn't particularly valuable as someone who would offer alternatives. He pointed out the problems, but he offered few solutions. Solutions, though, were offered, and Voltaire's noble, brilliant contemporary, Charles de Secondat, the Baron de Montesquieu, provided the rational constitutional model. In fact, in some ways, one of the most profound discussions of constitutional government ever written. Well, Montesquieu was extremely different from Voltaire. He was born a great aristocrat, twice a baron, a feudal lord from the south of France. He also was an active politician, something that Voltaire never was, of course. He sat on the Parlement of Bordeaux, and also he engaged in the aristocratic reaction to the absolute rule of Louis XIV that occurred after the death of that Sun King in 1715. Moreover, like Voltaire, he was openly elitist, but he wanted his particular class, the nobility, to play a much more important role in the kingdom, and in particular to be used to check the unnatural power of the crown that had grown up during the period of absolutism. And the book that established his thought as the central component of the Age of Reason and of constitutional theory was The Spirit of the Laws, De l'Esprit des Lois, of 1748. Like so many of the other works that followed, it was heavily dependent on Locke's second treatise of government, and Montesquieu's observations as well on the operation of the English political system. And like Hobbes and Locke, God or any supernatural force had nothing whatsoever to do with the structure or the operation of a society, because he, like the materialists and rationalists before, said there is no evidence whatsoever that's verifiable that God had ever intervened in human relations, so let's forget about it, put that aside, and let's talk about secular government. That is the responsibility that we, as men and women in society now, have to govern ourselves, to produce ideas, to bring them forth and apply them, and to create a society that will meet our secular needs and goals, like the Enlightenment said we needed to do. Moreover, he went further than that. He began also to say that not only are these human factors critical elements, but also there are contextual elements of equal importance. There are things like geography, climate, the traditions and practices of a people, the religious practices. All of these things help determine the organization of a state. The economic organization, the laws, all of these things are both causes and effects of a large and complex number of forces that determine the character of a state and the citizens that live within that state. Well, why is this so profound, and why was it such a revolutionary document, so revolutionary that in fact played an enormous role in the creation of the great republics of the 18th century? Well, it was suggested by Montesquieu that the Constitution is a reflection of the nature of society in which the men and women actually live. But at the same time, once you have created a society, once you have formed a government, the laws under which those citizens live also then change the character of the citizens. In other words, there's an element of what we're going to talk about near the end of this course, of social engineering. That in fact, a reasonable, rational, fair and elegant and balanced government will produce fair, balanced, rational people. And an irrational government, a government that is arbitrary, unfair, and unjust, will in fact produce irrational, unfair, and unjust people. So he suggested, given the complexity of human organization and the complexity of the forces at work, for a central authority to impose an alien structure on such an arrangement would be by definition unnatural, the worst word that any rationalist could use. Because institutions, whether political, economic, or social, must, the Baron argued, be organic. They must arise naturally from the context, the traditions, and the needs of the community itself. To impose something on the community is tyranny, and clearly against the dictates of both nature and reason. Well, obviously, the target of Montesquieu's critique was the centralized absolutism of the Ancien Regime in France. And in comparison with this, he looks at, the way Voltaire did, the balances inherent in the English system. And Voltaire and Montesquieu was in fact very insightful in the way he interpreted how the English constitution worked. Because he suggested that England enjoyed a mixed constitution in which the king represented the principle of monarchy, the House of Lords represented the principle of aristocracy, and the House of Commons that of democracy. And each one checked the unnatural growth of any one of the other constituent parts. So, for example, if the king should try and act in a tyrannical manner, he would be constrained by the aristocrats and by the commons. If the people started to act as mobs, with mob rule, then the king and the nobility would then check that unnatural growth. So this idea then of balance was critical. The other was what he called the separation of powers. There was a natural separation of powers, he argued, amongst the executive, the legislative, and the judicial authorities in England. And this meant that there was greater freedom for all citizens. He compared this to France, where the growth of royal power under Richelieu and under Louis XIV had altered the natural system of checks and balances which had once existed in France, but had been destroyed and suppressed by the rise of the power of the crown. Once there had been shared power amongst the nobility, the clergy, the municipal corporations, the parlement, and the monarchy. But now that was gone because the authority, the natural organic authority of these other groups were made subsidiary to the power of the king and his council at Versailles. Well, not only his observation of the English theorists, especially Locke, at work, made him appreciate how the Constitution of England operated, but also he repeated Locke, and in fact he reinforced Locke's statement that Englishmen are free because they're secure in those three inalienable rights. They're secure in their lives, their liberty, and their property. The king cannot rule alone, as the two revolutions of the 17th century indicated. Judges exercise an unregulated check on royal officers. The monarch cannot tax his people without their consent. And so the army cannot be used as an instrument of royal despotism because the army depends on taxes for its pay. The dangerous tendencies that he saw, and he was terrified of this, of mob rule and democracy, are constrained by the power left to the House of Lords and also through the restrictions on parliamentary representation. You had to have a certain amount of property to vote and to hold office. So he argued, put all of this together, and England is free because it has a natural constitution of checks and balances that restrained the ambitions of the king or any other group in society to overwhelm the others. And like Newton's laws of motion, such a constitution didn't need constant rewriting or monitoring because each group seeking its own self-interest and functioning rationally checked the others and ensured the successful maintenance of maximum freedom for all. Montesquieu then sought organic change based on traditions, natural authority, and also the experience of his own people. Because the King of France could break any law, trample any freedom, and suppress any traditional right with impunity, France was sick and needed remedy. And his great work, The Spirit of the Laws, offered a rational, practical alternative, one that appealed to such a great degree that the drafters of the Constitution of the United States used it as one of its guiding documents And when the revolution did break out in France, the ideas of Montesquieu will be seen to be animating that first constitution, where the separation of powers and checks and balances operated very, very clearly, reflecting that those bourgeois lawgivers who were trying to create a new France had learned very well from the barons' insightful observations of how society could best be determined according to rational principles.